Hey you, yeah, you who just clicked on this video, do not watch it. Seriously, don't. Unless you've already played this game. Why? I strongly recommend going into it without any preconceived notions, spoilers, or any info whatsoever, because that's what I did, and I think my experience with the game benefited from it greatly. Even if, like me, you found yourself disappointed with the last two games in the series, give this one a shot blind. Trust me. You could play a fan patch of the Japanese version that's currently out, or wait for the localization next summer. Also, if you're new to the series, do not play this as your first Trails game. It's too far into a continuous story. Don't let the bullshitters of NISA's marketing department or their shills tell you otherwise, like they tried to do with Cold Steel 3. Get off this video and go play Trails in the Sky. You've been warned. Also, I only have footage of the first part of the game, so what I'm talking about may not match what's on screen. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Kuro no Kiseki, Trails Through Daybreak as it's now known in the West, is the 11th game in this continuous series. I, however, played through a secret little version known as Trails Before Dawn, which is a fan translation patch. So if you happen to come across this video after the localization comes out, keep it in mind that this video is about my experience with the fan patch only. I have no faith in NISA localizing this game accurately and properly, and I'll get into that later in the video. Overall, I thought the fan patch did a great job at capturing the characters' personalities without shying away from writing them like actual adults. There's a lot of cursing and blatant shit-talking for certain main characters, and due to the nature of this story being heavily involved in the criminal underworld, it's very fitting. This game takes place in the region of Calvard, which seems to roughly be inspired by a mix of real-world medieval Europe and post-colonial North America, with many different influences around the country due to being a major central region surrounded by many different cultures. The main city the game takes place in, Edith, reminds me of New York or Boston, something like that, due to the architecture and landmarks, but I could be wrong because I never leave the house. Regardless, I found each and every location in this game to be much more immersive and fleshed out than locations in previous games, and I spent a lot more time just wandering around and looking at things than I usually do. One point of comparison is Crossbell, as like the two Crossbell games, Edith is like the hub that is central to the story, but I think it's so much better than Crossbell. To the point that throughout my entire experience with the Trail series, I never really stopped and thought about what my favorite location was from the series until now. It's probably Edith. The Crossbell games, Zero and Azure, are also the best point of comparison in how the story moves along. The main cast is a group of private investigators rather than a detachment of the police force, and they spend time working with various organizations, both above and below the law, in Edith, then each chapter takes them somewhere outside of Edith to complete their investigation. And that's one aspect that makes this story and main character infinitely more interesting from the get-go than any other from the previous games. The main character, Van Arkride, is much older than previous protagonists, being 24 at the beginning of the game, with a lot more life experience under his belt. His backstory does remain a mystery for much of the game, only giving hints here and there until the final acts, but the way he presents himself throughout the game is confident, intelligent, witty, charming, and sometimes a bit edgy, makes him easily my favorite character in the game. The last Trails protagonist I felt this way about was all the way back in Sky the Third, so it was refreshing to have such a great character leading the game for the first time in a long time. What also made it so refreshing was the fact that, unlike previous main characters, he is not a lawful good character like most JRPG protagonists. More of a true neutral, or even chaotic neutral type, willing to bend or even break the rules whenever it suits him. And this plays into a new feature that they worked into the story that gave meaning to the dialogue and story options mixed into the side quests, and eventually, the main story. You have an alignment system based on law, neutral, or gray as the game calls it, and chaos, that affects how certain quests play out. I, of course, committed to full chaos. Keep that in mind for later. The prologue starts off with a murder mystery, which is unusual for this series because nobody ever dies, let alone on screen, giving the game a lot of noir inspiration, and I was all in for that, because it works so well with the way the series emphasizes criminal investigation as a major part of its main and side quests, which has been integral to the series since the first Trails in the Sky. The whole main story revolves around finding these devices called the Genesis, which were some of the first orbments ever made by Epstein, not that one. and how their power is important to the future of the world. But there's also a dangerous group of people also looking for and using them to their own ends. The Mafia, known as Almada. The one who tips off the search is Agnes, a high schooler who... Wait... Falcom, can you not with the high school thing? It doesn't have to be a part of every anime story, just saying. Anyway, Agnes is like the biggest normie character in the world, with not a lot interesting going for her throughout the game other than one aspect of her backstory that is only revealed much later, that being that she's the president's daughter. But even that isn't explored much because President Roy Gramhart barely has a role in this game's story at all. Anyway, Chapter 1 gives us what's basically a pre-hentai moment with that reporter girl Marielle, which is like, okay, more fan service moments just for the sake of it, I guess. Then we get our third party member, a 13-year-old child soldier Jaeger girl, and I was like, man, I thought this was going to be a more adult Trails game, but I guess not. Fairy is kind of normal for this kind of character in this series, other than her being our first introduction to this world's Middle East-inspired region to the southeast of Calvard. But then my disappointment was completely flipped on its head at the end of Chapter 1. First, Walter shows up, and he's our main Ouroboros connection in this game, as they don't have a very major role this time around. Probably not until the second or third part of the story, I'd assume. I haven't played Kuro 2 yet, so keep that in mind. No spoilers. Anyway, I love Walter in this game. His presence alone gives Almada, the main antagonists, a run for their money, and makes it very interesting whenever Ouroboros shows up in this game. But secondly, the ending of this chapter results in the battle between the main cast and Ada, a Jaeger captain who's been corrupted by one of the Genesis into these vampire-like monster humans. And she plans on killing all of her comrades and herself to prevent them from losing control and attacking innocent people. This was a pretty gut-wrenching moment and resulted in all of these corrupt Jaegers, including Ada, dying as a result. It's the end of Chapter 1, and more people have died on screen than all other Trails games combined. My expectations were kinda shattered at this point, and I was hooked. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 pretty much move along in similar ways, each serving to introduce us to a new main character that decides to join Van's solution office at the beginning of the next chapter. Chapter 2 brought us Aaron, who I fucking love. This guy is a total smartass and plays off Van's personality perfectly. Probably the funniest moments in the game involved these two, as well as some interesting Fujoshi bait fanservice moments that were very rare in previous games. Chapter 3 brought us Reset, who had been helping Van with his combat orbment and new AI in the background, and has a very dry and formal personality. We don't really learn too much about her throughout the game other than her body was almost entirely robotic and experimental, but nothing about what happened to her in the past other than vague references. Chapter 4 brought us Quatre, a young genius boy who has some interesting personality quirks, such as being afraid of public baths with other males, and always wearing a chest covering. I spoiled this part for myself because I was mad the game made me wait until later games for him to talk about it, but this is one of those things that I do not think NISA will handle properly or accurately due to the obsession and sensitivity with gender stuff in the West. Hopefully I'm wrong, but we'll have to wait and see. Then we have the game's obligatory Hot Springs Detour intermission because of course. Well, at least they got to take the other best character in the game along with them, Yume. She made this little side story much more bearable. But then we get to have the movie star and side vigilante Judith join up after the dumbest fan service moment scene in the game that is just like the previous games. Well, one thing I can say is that at least this game is more honest about it, and isn't full of cringy teenage harem fantasies or anything like that. But then the intermission introduces us to my least favorite character in the game, and I'm probably going to get shit for this, but Shizuna Rem Mitsurugi is the lamest character ever. Just an overpowered Japan-inspired waifu bait character made for masturbatory and Japanese culture self-masturbatory reasons. I'm not convinced that I will ever like this character, but I've been surprised more than once in this series. Like what happens right after the intermission. Almada nukes Krail Village, like absolutely obliterates it. Everything you explored and everyone that you met there in Chapter 1 is now gone, and so is Dingo Brad, a renowned journalist and one of Van's best friends, who was investigating a lead into Gerard, the leader of Almada. Damn, shit just got absolutely real. Chapter 5 was one of the most insane chapters in series history. We also got Burgard to join us, whose identity is actually Barkhorn, a former dominion of the church who was presumed dead since Cold Steel 3, I think. Yeah, things are getting insanely interesting. Almada leads everyone to Oracion, the former capital of Calvard. The main cast, Ouroboros, the Bracer Guild, Heiue, multiple Jaeger Corps, the Weapons Development Corporation Marduk, other mafias, and even various members of the Septian Church, all led to the same place to take part in a twisted death game, forced to battle royale with each other until there's one group left to challenge Gerard himself, or else he will destroy the entire city. This part got a little bit into the hard-to-believe territory, but one thing that was really cool was that it made the alignment system actually matter, as your alignment will allow you to choose different allies to work with based on your previous choices. Being committed to chaos, I naturally wound up working with Ouroboros, which was awesome. We got introduced to the fourth Anguis, Elroy Harwood, who was an absolutely terrifying individual due to his history with various criminal organizations and an utterly twisted and sadistic nature. Also Lucretia, who's kinda just there, but she and Walter end up joining your party as guests, and they absolutely destroy everything you come across, especially Walter. I fucking loved this. Although it did make it a bit on the easy side, but I ain't complaining cause it was just too awesome. But the other interesting part of this chapter was that you get law and chaos choices for the main story as well when you fight each of the Mafia's leaders. You can choose to subdue them with a potential consequence, or finish them off, having Van kill them himself. And man, that's when my chaos alignment started to feel like a mistake, but I stuck with it because unlike Falcom, I chose to commit. Then the showdown with Gerard gave us the implication that he had been searching for Van specifically before he dies. The only one left of Almada at this point was Melchior. And hot damn, this dude was one of the game's highlights as well because he's an absolutely psychotic motherfucker, willing to cross many lines that other villains wouldn't. Everything calms down as the final chapter begins, and this was probably my least favorite part of the game because there's so much filler to go through before the main events kick off. Then when it does, it goes into hard-to-believe territory again, because all of the Mafia leaders come back to life, and everyone and everything in Edith freezes in time, except for people tied to Van for some reason. The town becomes full of demons that attack anyone still moving, so you have to go through each district and break these weird orbs to delete the barriers to move on. It just seems so contrived, but whatever. It was for the sake of having more combat segments, I guess. Then at the end, you have to fight all the Mafia leaders again, and the game also gives you an optional boss that's different depending on your alignment, which is interesting. But that would be the last we see of the alignment system in the game, unfortunately. Would have liked to see at least slightly different endings depending on my choices, but eh. Also, Gerard's whole motivation of wanting to create the ultimate fear was a weird motivation to be honest, but we finally get to learn that he was the one who experimented on Van as a child in the DG cult to create the Diabolic Core, a source of immense demonic power that's tied to one of the 77 devils, which is like holy shit. That's fucked up, man. Killing Gerard for good makes the Diabolic Core reunite with Van's body, turning him into the devil himself. Then the rest of the main party travel to the Beyond to defeat it as the true final boss, and bring Van back to his companions. Essentially, his new family. Man, this story has some very serious and dire implications that featured some of the most interesting aspects of this series' lore. That being the extremely fucked up side of humanity where most JRPGs fear to tread, such as with the DG cult, and the overall relationship between humanity, religion, and the spiritual underworld, such as with the 77 devils. As a lore nerd, this game really appealed to me in ways I haven't been so heavily immersed in since Trails in the Sky III and the Crossbell duology. Unfortunately, I hear Kuro 2 is a return to Falcom's other form, that being a game with tons of filler and fan service padding that's entirely unnecessary. Which isn't surprising though, because throughout Kuro 1, they found 7 of the Genesis devices, but there are 8 of them, meaning finding the last one will be stretched to an entire game. I'll reserve judgment until I actually play it myself. Oh yeah, there's one very important character in this game I haven't talked about yet, and Van's interactions with her are probably the only thing I really didn't like about him. Elaine Auclair. I do not like Elaine. Every time she and Van interact with each other, there is an immature tension between them that they can never seem to get over, and it's really annoying. But even without that, Elaine is just a dry and uninteresting character to me. Oh well. Overall, I really enjoyed this game's story. It really surprised me in various ways, such as the fact that Falcom seemed to be listening to a lot of the very valid criticisms they've been getting. There were less of the ridiculous Deus Ex Machina moments that plagued the Cold Steel series, and more people die in this game than all other Trails games combined by a long shot. It's been a long time, but I felt like I could actually take this story seriously again. Almada were actually dangerous, disturbing villains that even Ouroboros seemed to have concerns about. I'm curious to see what the Genesis does when all of them are gathered together, and its time-halting powers make me think someone's going to uncover the Septarian of Time by the end of this arc, which would be interesting because the time element seems to be the most associated with darkness and the underworld, while by contrast, the space element seemed to be loosely associated with holiness and the light, which we learned about in the Sky trilogy. The story was definitely the main highlight of this game, but I also enjoyed a lot of the new features, though there were some hiccups here and there. Gameplay-wise, they did an interesting thing with the combat, allowing you to battle monsters in an action style outside of the turn-based battles. This is used to give yourself an advantage over them before deploying the shard that begins turn-based combat, but if you're careless, you could get severely disadvantaged instead. I liked this idea, but it definitely needed some tuning because the action combat was basic and not very fun, which is ironic considering Falcom also makes the E-series, which has very good, fun action combat, even in the same game engine. As for the turn-based aspect, it is changed a bit, allowing you to move your character before taking action, whereas before, moving and actions were separate commands. I liked it better this way, but at the same time, it made a lot of battles very easy to exploit. For example, Van is the ultimate tank character. You can move him to a corner of the battlefield, use his coin bullet move to draw enemies' attention, and bam, you have free reign with every other character to do whatever they want, even against pretty much any boss in the game. At least tanking got its time to shine, I guess, because tanking was much less effective in previous games. I felt like I was playing with the combat for less than half of the total playtime though. Most of the runtime will be doing side quests and watching cutscenes. At least, that's what it felt like, but I wasn't keeping track. Fortunately, it wasn't that big of a deal because the story was so interesting this time around, and combat is pretty basic compared to other games, so it may have gotten repetitive if it took up more time. Otherwise, this would have really bothered me because I normally do not like it when games feel hands-off for most of it. Looking at you, Sony. But I also admittedly spent a lot more time exploring and looking around each location than previous games, so there's that too. Some other improvements include having better character animations and models, and also having animations feel more natural, rather than unnaturally slow like before. It's an improvement all around in that regard, but still needs work, because characters still only have a handful of animations during conversations and such. Oh, and they're still doing that stupid thing where only one character has voice acting in a conversation between two or more people. That shit makes me want to turn off the voice acting entirely. Stop it. Instead of bonding moments, these were changed to connect events, which added interesting tidbits to the overall story rather than being power of friendship silliness like in Cold Steel, and doing enough of them gave permanent buffs to your characters or some special items, which was nice. There was also that gourmet system, which was just entirely superfluous and didn't really add anything interesting to the game, just added a lot of missable food items. I also thought that the music was a step up from the Cold Steel games overall, but still nowhere near my favorite, which is still Sky the Third. There were a few songs that didn't click with me, but for the most part, the music fit the overall theme of urban mystery, noir, and American styles like jazz fused with Falcom's usual style of JRPG music. Now, let's talk about NISA for a bit. I brought up before that they probably won't respect the character of Quatre. They also have already done this to Elaine by changing her title from Sword Maiden to Beauty's Blade. I don't care what NISA's opinions on the titles are. Their reasons for changing it are garbage. Her Sword Maiden title is part of her character, and it was chosen deliberately for the sake of her character. Throughout the game, I remember at least 2 instances where the characters reference her title for the sake of banter or teasing or some other reason. And from what I remember, Elaine just shrugs it off. This is part of her story, and they changed it just because they don't like it. Absolutely zero respect for the source material they are working on. Furthermore, I also mentioned that this is a much more adult game than previous Trails games in several aspects. People get killed, there's a lot more violence and blood, A lot more nudity and sexual references, including a strip club, brothels, prostitutes, etc., due to the story having a lot of ties to the criminal underworld and many of the main characters being fully grown adults who don't shy away from such topics. There's also a lot of cursing and adult language in the fan translation. I can't read Japanese, so I can't personally attest to the accuracy of this translation, but it works very well for the characters like Aaron who speak in a crass and crude way very often. Assuming it is accurate, I expect it to be heavily toned down in the official localization by comparison because a lot of it is politically incorrect, we'll say. If the fan translation was released as is, I wouldn't be surprised if the game got an M rating. If the localization gets a T rating, you can safely assume that the game had been heavily toned down by NISA before it comes out. We have several months until then, but those are my predictions. Also, Trails Through Daybreak is a weird name, and seems to just be a blatant ripoff of the fan translation, Trails Before Dawn. At least that's just my uncharitable interpretation of things, I guess. Lastly, where would I place certain moments of this game if I remade my top 10 favorite and least favorite moments videos? For favorite, I would probably have to choose the carnival in Chapter 5 due to all the insanity that it entailed. That chapter was a wild ride and was set in a very cool looking medieval Europe fused with colonial America inspired city. Chapter 4 had some interesting implications that called back to the crapshoot main story of Reverie and made the whole singularity thing relevant to the ongoing story. Probably an honorable mention. Also, any moment involving the most powerful character in the game, Yume. Her cuteness could move mountains, just saying. For least favorite, I'd probably stick the cheap fan service moments from the Intermission Hot Springs episode into the dishonorable mentions. Biased, I know. I don't think this game had any egregious moments that ruined the main story all that much, so I can't think of anything else. Hopefully that won't change with Kuro 2, but my expectations will be, well, you know. I think that's all I have to say about this game. Thanks for watching if you stuck around for the whole thing. If you haven't yet, feel free to check out my top 10 favorite and least favorite moments in the Trails series videos. If I'm still doing this video thing by the time the Kuro arc ends, maybe I will do a remake of those videos. Also check out my top 10 favorite and least favorite JRPG protagonists and antagonists, the latter of which is probably my favorite video I've ever made. I think you'll enjoy them too. Maybe. Maybe you'll hate my guts for my slander of certain JRPG series that Nintendo owns. Anyway, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Follow me on Rumble, Odyssey, Twitter, or join my humble Discord server if you want. And remember, have high standards, low expectations. Especially for NISA.